All right, let's get started. I look forward to this. Forgive me for my reading skills and my pronunciation. I'm looking up constantly on the words, but it's important. All right. So we're on page 16, according to my book. I stopped where it says the nonviolent civil rights movement. Give everybody a chance to get to that point. All right, let's go ahead. Oh, it's page 20 in the PDF? Okay. The nonviolent civil rights movement of the 1960s didn't advertise it, but it was quietly armed to the teeth itself. It had to be. Drive-by shootings and assassinations by Klan and police. Night riders were a normal hazard of life then and there. In reaction, self-defense militias such as the Deacons for Defense, which spread from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, took up the battle for survival of new African communities with rifles and shotguns. And a good example was the small Mississippi River town of Cairo, Illinois, which was one of the hardest fought local battles. White citizen councils, quote, night riders, with police assistance, did drive-by shooting up black homes and the housing projects every night, month after month, for years. Not only did a local defense militia have to be formed by Reverend after month for years. Not only did a local defense militia have to be formed by Reverend Cohen and other church leaders, but on the weekends, a loose alliance of Chicago gang youth started by communist teenagers in the Black Disciplines gang would arm up and drive downstate. What?
Sorry, my internet's a little slow right now. Black Disciples.
Thank you. Would arm up and drive downstate to take part in the fight. A grim battle fought without any headlines, as remote from the suburban shopping malls and Wall Street as if it were in, Czechia. However, covered over with political cosmetics, America was in a low-intensity war of assassinations and militias, of extra-legal police action and vigilantes, of gangs and a handful of guerrillas back then. This was a time when unaliving whites was something openly talked about again, in a way that it hadn't been since the day of Nat Turner and the slave revolts. The respected white writer Amir Barkara was winning awards for his off-Broadway plans in which, quote, innocent whites were confronted with and even unalived. His poetry demanded, quote, here it is, we want poems like fists beating inwards out of jocks. We want poems that unalive, they use kill. Which is one reason that George Jackson's X-ray vision of capitalism, his defiant guerrilla warfare politics, resonated with so many oppressed youth, even in chains, publicly foreseeing his own assassination in prison. He still hurled his defense, quote, I'm going to charge reparations in blood, war without terms, end quote. Some small groups and individuals had begun to just do that. It was just natural, and it wasn't just Mark Essex sniping so lethally from the rooftops in downtown New Orleans. Some in the group, D. Mau Mau, which liberal journalists later described as a loose network of 40 to 50 new Africans, Vietnam veterans, carried out random executions in 1972. White settlers in the suburban Chicago and Boston area were targeted. The Cook County state attorneys warned his public of the nationwide conspiracy of unaliving whites, while the Chicago newspaper ran widely headlines like Schmurder gangs. You can see, okay, here we go. Hold on a second. 3,000 strong, and the Mew Mew taking over from Panthers. Separate from that, but in the same city and in the same year of 1972, Yaki and a friend were convicted of taking part in other killings. It was during a period when Illinois' death penalty has been knocked down by the higher courts, so the judge sentenced Yaki instead to 200 years in prison. The prison that Yaki re-entered back then mirrored the grassroots politics of the larger community, in that they were nationalists, not integrationists. Remember that by the early 1960s, the membership of the original Nation of Islam, led by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X, was usually estimated that over 200,000, making it by far the largest black political organization. Inside the prisons, on the left, the largest progressive grouping were the nationalist religious sects, most notable the NOI itself, and later on the East Coast, the Nation of Gods and Earths, aka 5%ers. There were independent political survival organizations like the Black Guerrilla Family in California, and small conscious collectives like members from the old Civil Rights Group, the Black Panther Party, Black Liberation Army, Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa, etc., all scattered in various prisons. When Yaki re-entered the Illinois prison, he joined young but experienced fighters such as Lance Bell from the Black Panther Party and Don Taylor from the D Mau Mau, young but experienced fighters such as Lance Bell from the Black Panther Party and Don Taylor from the D Mau Mau, both in the Pontiac Prisoners Organization, and from the D Mau Mau, both in the Pontiac Prisoners Organization, and Abdul from the BPP in the Stateville Prisoners Abdul from the BPP in the Stateville Prisoners Organization. One of the nationalistic right politically within the prison were the large organization. One of the nationalistic right politically within the prison were the large youth gangs with their, quote, colonial/criminal mentality and belief in lumpen capitalism, conflict on a lower level with the guards and prison administration, but at the same time had extensive illicit businesses and political arrangements with the higher ups. This only made partially visible the complex political terrain usually hidden beneath the surface of the colony. To understand Yaki's politics, you first have to understand that revolutionary nationalism was at its intense core. In this, Yaki was a direct heir of Malcolm X. Revolutionary nationalism recognized that we, having been developed historically as a colony, in reality comprise a separate nation of our own, a people who have the right of self-determination and who are sovereign unto ourselves. Although the U.S. empire liked to encourage the myth that it's American Inc., it's somehow immortal and permanently fixed in shape. Like all nations, it has been deliberately changed many times and will inevitably be changed again, whether anyone likes it or not. Within the continental Euro-settler empire, we have always been an oppressed internal colony. As Yaki liked to say, quote, the black nation exists, objectively and subjectively, but it is not yet independent. A Newsweek magazine survey in 1969 found that 27% of northern black youth under 30, quote, would like a separate black nation, end quote, while 50% support the urban riots, quote unquote, and 68% approve of the, quote, the idea of black power. The government's own U.S. National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders did survey which discovered that the typical, quote, rioter had, quote, great pride in his race. He is extremely hostile to whites. He is almost equally hostile towards middle class black people. He is substantially better informed about politics than black people who were not involved in the riots. Yaki always pointed out that there is no question of new African people escaping the acceptance of one nationalism or another. In fact, the ever escaping the acceptance of one nationalism or another. In fact, the ever-changing debate over what name people should use to Yaki only reflected the inescapable inner search for nationhood. Here we go. What's this right here? Who's in here? We'll bring one person up just to see if we get any coins. All right. It's generally understood that Assalamu alaikum. Integration is a rejection of nationalism, but it's only the rejection of one nationalism and the acceptance of another. When we refer to people as integrationists, we're saying that they embrace the ideology of the dominant society, i.e. white nationalism and American nationalist. We're saying that they embrace the ideology of the dominant society, i.e. white nationalism and American nationalism, or capitalism or imperialism. While rejecting the ideology of, say, black nationalism, i.e. anti-capitalism and socialism, we tend to be unmindful of the fact that nationalism is about ideology and politics, not color. When we refer to people as nationalists, we are saying that they have or are shaping an ideology and a particular set of social relations. The context of the and process of our, quote, name debates on these shores had their effective point of origins at the ones on the onset of the oppressive relationship, the movement that we were captured, sold, placed into pens and dungeons aboard ships bound west. The context and process evolved as we set foot on these shores. All of this constituted an assault upon our freedom, our history, and humanity, upon our identity. Do you recall the scene in the movie Roots where we're inside the slave ship and the brother said, quote, and the brother says, talk to the sister or brother next to you, learn their language, teach them your language. We must become one people. We didn't land on these shores with the collective identity as slaves, black people, or black people. They used the N-word on one of those for black. Not even as Africans. We arrived here as, say, Wulu, Abo, and Fula. However, we had already begun to change, to develop an identity as a new people. We initially called ourselves Africans, but underneath it all, we knew then, better than most of us know now, that we were new Africans, a new people forged through our collective oppression by an emerging capitalism and a unique form of settler colonialism. We became Africans, but soon some among us wanted to be other than what we were. Black people, N-words, colored people, people of color, American, anything but African or new African. These some no longer wanted to identify with the majority of the people and our interests. They no longer wanted to maintain a united opposition to the oppressive social order. Instead, some opt for inclusion and equality as defined by the oppressor. These some were the embryonic native elites among us and on these shores, the emergent pseudo-bourgeoisie, petite bourgeoisie, whose successors were among those who, in the late 1980s, called for a new term by which to identify us by way renegotiating the terms of rules previously agreed to by them and their colonial masters. In 1830s and 40s and 50s weren't the first nor the last period during which we waged class struggle under cover of debates over what to call ourselves. Most people over 30 years of age will recall the debate in the 1960s, N-words for black and black, while people under 30 may best recall the debates in the late 1980s over black and African American. Few of us, however, understood these debates as forms of class struggle among the people, which also marked changes in the development and structural forms of our collective oppression. Yaki and his comrades took up the name New Africa.
Please give please.
Please give Fatima if you can. After the conventions of nationalists on March 29th, 1968, named their nation and the Declaration of Independence. That convention of 500 black nationalists gathered in Detroit formed a provisional government of the Republic of New Africa, PG/RNA, with the active support of tens of thousands of many different cities. A 5-state national territory was imaginatively claimed out of the historic Black Belt of 50 new African majority countries that had stretched in the contingents arc up from the Louisiana Delta all the way to the Atlantic Ocean for much of the past several centuries. This not only reflected the traditional roots of the rural South that we had created with our labor, but an always present sense of separate territory. It isn't an accident that, to use just one example, in the former Harold Ike's public housing project in Chicago South Side, which had a number of large apartment buildings together with its own illicit fried chicken shop, an illegal DVD music store, and other formal apartment businesses. Residents called their housing complex, quote, the land. In revolutionary nationalist understanding, our national territory is always called, quote, the land. And this phrase is an constant presence behind Yaki's teaching. While this pioneering attempt at new African self-government didn't fully survive the violent police repression and the neo-colonial offensive that followed Yaki, as later briefly ministered of information for the PGRNA. The subversive name of, quote, New African is still heard. The great hip-hop artist Tupac Shakur himself, the son of a Black Panther and PGRNA militants, and the famous Los Angeles youth gang writer Sayakai Shakur, a rad of Yaki's and the author of the best-selling autobiography Monsters, are among those who have kept the name alive. It's a hardcore thing now. In 1960s, revolutionary nationalism was different from our global familiar old zombie capitalistic nationalism in two important respects. This revolutionary nationalism was fundamentally internationalist and involved not the separating of some old society or narrow-minded ethnic group, but liberation through the making of a new people. Being part of making a new non-exploitative world, both ideas were central to Yaki's politics. This internationalism was common to both his main teachers. It was Malcolm X, after all, who used to declare dramatically to his brothers and sisters, quote, the Black Revolution.
Please give it me, Bladar. أرجوكم وني أليكسي.
The Black Revolution is sweeping Africa. The Black Revolution is sweeping Asia. The Black Revolution is sweeping Latin America. So, to X, black didn't mean simply race or skin color. It, in the shallow American sense, to X, it stood for the whole world of the oppressed. Even more, Yaki followed George Jackson in insisting that revolutionaries here have to develop themselves up to the level of other anti-colonial revolutionaries worldwide. That internationalism also means admitting that so many people here in Babylon are confused politically and can learn much from thinkers and fighters in other countries and times. George, when Yaki and his generations just said, quote, George, you knew that they meant George Jackson, had a special place as a model to Yaki because George had spent part of his childhood and his entire adult life in America. Special place as a model to Yaki because George had spent part of his childhood and his entire adult life in American gulags and was largely self-taught as a revolutionary, just as Yaki was. George, like X, refused to let people hold pity parties for themselves. They ruthlessly criticized people on all levels for refused to let people hold pity parties for themselves. They ruthlessly criticized people on all levels for deceiving themselves so often and for not reaching up to the advances of world liberation struggles. The clearest example of this is after the Illinois Black Panther Party youth leader Fred Hampton was assassinated by the Chicago Police Death Squad, killed in a pre-dawn attack on the Panthers communal housing and headquarters on December 4th, 1969. Hampton, who was shot in his bed, was killed on the spot, as was Mark Clark, while 4 other Panthers were seriously wounded in the surprise attack. There was a storm of community anger about the police tactics, which hardly even bothered hiding the fact that the police death squad was not about doing arrests, but planning assassinations. But George, without hesitation, went against the liberal tide and placed the spotlight squarely on the confusion of black activists and revolutionaries. It should never be easy for them to destroy us. If you start with Malcolm X and count all of the brothers who have died or been captured, since you will find that not even one of them was really prepared for a fight. No imagination or fighting style was evident in any one of the incidents, but each of them died professing to know the nature of our enemies. It should never be easy for them. Edward V. Harana, Illinois State Attorney General, sent 15 pigs to raid the Panther headquarters and murder Hampton and Clark. Do you have any idea what would have happened to those 15 pigs if they had run into many Viet Congs? As there were Panthers in that building? The VC are still little people with less general education than we have. The argument that they have been doing it longer has no validity at all, because they were doing it just as well when they started as they are now. It's very contradictory for a man to teach about the schmurder in corporate capitalism, to isolate and expose the schmurderers behind it, to instruct that these bad men, they use the word mad, sorry, are completely oh my gosh, what's this word? Licentious, totally depraved, and then not making adequate preparations to defend themselves from the wild people's attack. Mad, anyways. It should go without saying that George personally fought pigs in the most difficult environments. No excuses. Yaki filed that lesson away to and refer to it often. If you have George, Yaki would say, thinking about Jackson's new book, that's all you'll ever need. Like Jackson and Malcolm X, for that matter, like the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., Amir Baraka, Kwame Ture, and many other new African leaders and activists, Yaki was an anti-capitalist and a socialist. He usually called his politics, quote, scientific socialism or communalism. He didn't call himself a Marxist, since the whole idea of Europeans owning or having naming rights to communalism as an idea was just messed up to him. He took his global economics from people like the revolutionary intellectuals like Samir Amin, and his ideas about how to do revolution from comrades like Amilcar Cabral, the brilliant founder of the Guinea-Bissau Revolution in Africa, Ho in Vietnam, and many others. Yaki tried to learn from the whole revolutionary world and strongly taught that viewpoint to others. It didn't take long after you met Yaki to realize that he was not just smart, but unusually smart. Freaky smart. Smarter even than his writing seems. This is hard to describe, but it was like walking at night and then coming under the street light. It was in that diffused cone of light. All of a sudden you can clearly see yourself and others by you. Even read a newspaper and you couldn't in a few steps before. Being around Yaki was like walking under the street light in the darkness. He had gone through terrible events, losses that can break you at an age when most young men are thinking about losses that can break you at an age when most young men are thinking about sharp clothing and romance. As a young Ho Chi Minh once wrote in a prison poem that Yaki liked, calamity has hardened my mind and turned it into steel. What you meant was someone who was seriously disciplined, something Rebs always talked about, but so few of us really are. Discipline, not in any macho stiffness, but mentality and personal development. He didn't have one strange habit. He seriously worked at never lying to his brothers and sisters. How impossible is that if you really think about it? Which meant that political discussions with him had a different rhythm to it. Many times which meant that political discussions with him had a different rhythm to it. Many times a topic or a question would be met with only silence when he thought that what he did believe was too offensive to you, or too undigested. I think that's undigested. To be useful. All right. But what he did say was what he believed to be true, popular or not. He worked at being calm, which, with his anger and razor sense of the cost of human weaknesses, was sometimes hard. One afternoon, as we were talking about some well-known political prisoners who was loudly proclaiming to the world his total innocence, Yaki looked around and crowded visiting room and said with a straight face, "Oh yeah, we're all innocent here," end quote. Yaki soon became a leading activist in a small prison collective in his state, first in the Stateville Prison Organization, which quickly grew into the New African Prison Organization, the NOPO. There were groups in Stateville's Pontiac and Menard prison, as well as individual members in other prisons outside Illinois, and rads on the streets. Yaki also became an influence in less public organization, One thing, he never became as well known. There were definite reasons for this. In part because Yaki was a very private person who rarely talked about his inner life or childhood, and who never wanted to write about his own past to a curious public. In fact, he turned down a potential major book contract for just such an autobiography. Becoming a radical celebrity was not anywhere in his plans. Yaki was also unknown because of the role he chose for himself. Much of his writings were not for the public or even the community as a whole. Most of them were cadre teachings. Typically, Yaki wrote and spoke as a teacher for those already knew African revolutionaries who were cadre. Those who had accepted the responsibility of being organizers and local teachers themselves. Although he was often repeating or underscoring basic political lessons, sometimes these were almost technical discussions, craft discussions. In the same way that young 5%ers proudly talked about, quote, "I can do the math, I know the numbers," and as such, his words weren't meant to be entertaining. The Rads often complained of finding them as hard to read as some textbook, far from easy reading. But it's like if you wanted to be able to design the flow of water through hydroelectric plant, or by brain surgery on an infant at the very start, you'd be cracking the book late into the night and studying for all you were worth. Yaki didn't think that trying to transform society was any easier. If you were Yaki's chosen audience, that meant he expected that you were reading carefully, hour after hour, dictionary by your side. Who? Like me, yeah. Just as he had to. Taking notes, rereading often, thinking about what every sentence means. It is your work to do this. In this book, incidentally, are a variety of kinds of writings from Yaki, some more difficult and some easier to get into. And as a revolutionary, Yaki felt no need to put himself out on the front street. Remember that by this time, Huey Newton's Black Panther Party, or self-defense, had been crushed in blood, with over 30 Panthers unalived, thousands in the prisons from California to Maryland, and many other Panthers as fugitives and exiles. Even the poet Amir Baraka's hopeful community culture project in Harlem, his black art schools had been drawn in blood by police infiltrations and convenient anonymous murders. It was open hunting season on new African radicals, and Yaki was moved to write a work politically under many different names, often doing things but not taking any public credit for it. Again, nothing new there. Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam, for example, worked so carefully at effacing himself that by the start of the Vietnam War, U.S. intelligence agency and scholars weren't sure even what his real name had been, not Ho Chi Minh. It was through this revolutionary writings that Yaki was primarily best known. Professor Teresa Perry of Marquette University assembled her landmark book, Teaching Malcolm X, a collection of essays for educators teaching students about X in 1996. She asked Yaki to contribute his articles on, quote, the meaning of Malcolm X from an imprisoned African in the U.S. For this university book, his essays have been often reprinted. Yaki also contributed the introduction of the new education of Can't Jail the Spirit, the widely circulated collections of biographies of leftist political prisoners in the USA. But it wasn't just his pen that was at work. Yaki also played an active role in the number of prison and community struggles. Although, hold on a second, who do I have in here? All right. Although seldom leaving his name attached to them, in 1977 and 78, the New African Prisoner Organization helped the illegal defense and mobilized public support, quote, on the bricks, end quote, for the Stateville Four. After 2 guards had been attacked, the phoned? The phoned up, is that phoned? I'm gonna go look it up. Is it phoned? The phoned up, is that phoned? I'm gonna go look it up. Is it phoned? The phoned up, is that phoned? I'm gonna go look it up. It's phonied up, my bad. Phonied up murderer and aggravated assault charges against the 4 prisoners just blew away in the wind after this sudden resistance. Injustice is so aggravated assault charges against the 4 prisoners just blew away in the wind after this sudden resistance. Injustice is so routine in the camps that men really woke up when a serious state attack like that was being the pigs. Amid off, of course. It being the pigs. Amid Akbar and Wada and Kenyatta and Hai Shim just became the targets of extra legal vengeance by the prison administration. All 4 were given backdated administrative tickets for possessing weapons. In essence, the same bogus, no evidence charges that the state had to drop criminal prosecutions on. They lost good time and were transferred for a time into isolation cells in other prisons. Still, it was a relative victory for sure. That was like the storm warning for a much larger, much more complex prison struggle soon to come. The 1978-81 Pontiac prison revolt and its subsequent trial. I think it's Pontiac, was the second oldest prison in the Illinois system, having been constructed shortly after the end of the Civil War, with cell houses and buildings tacked on as needed throughout the years. It was both a maximum security camp and a minimum security one, holding some 2,000 men who were mostly from the Chicago area. On July 22nd, 1978, and around 9:45 a.m., as some hundreds of prisoners were filing from the rec yard back to the cell house, a small band of prisoners suddenly attacked a few guards. Within minutes, the lieutenant and 2 other male guards were dead. 2 male guards were down but alive, with seriously stabbed wounds, and a woman guard was assaulted. Much of the cell house was seized by suddenly lucid prisoners. To retake the part of the prison that afternoon, the state police and guards fired canisters after canisters of CS gas into the building. Prisoners who were running around and prisoners who had been already locked in their cells alike were gassed. Fires were set. It was general chaos. The state had the bodies of 3 slain guards and an upset white community. The prison is a major institution locally, not of the 2 largest employers of Livingston County. But they had no idea of why it happened or who had done it. what was typical. The government didn't even care, really, just so long as they could, quote, make an example and assemble enough new African victims for a mass lynching and an impressive sacrifice to terrorize and to show that they were firmly in charge, just like at the infamous Abu Ghraib at Guantanamo prison. The U.S. empire didn't care who was innocent or guilty, just as long as they had enough colonial subjects to chain, to vent their fear and anger on. In this case, the government claimed that a factional grand conspiracy existed in which all the black gangs and the prisons had banded together to plan and carry out the attack all together. Although there was no evidence against anyone, desperate prosecutors finally spent many tens of thousands of dollars freeing and bribing a few prisoners who promised to testify the state's way. Although most ended up not doing it. What followed was much more significant than the outbreak itself. 48 prisoners were indicted, except for several Latinos. All were black, of whom 31 ended up being tried. Some were tried downstate in various towns, primarily Bloomington, for, quote, lesser charges, such as arson, mob action, aggravated assault, or burglary. But 17 prisoners were charged with capital murder, and after defense motions, they were divided into several trial groups, and the first mass trial set in Chicago. This was one of the larger mass death penalty cases in U.S. history since the old slave rebellions. And as usual, the defendants were primarily poor new Africans. But other than that, nothing at all about this was usual. It wasn't anything like Perry Mason or CSI on television. Not even like anyone's idea of what criminal trials were like. Whoever spun that saying about, quote, we don't always get to choose our battles in life, end quote, hit this one right on the head. The Pontiac Rebellion murder trial was like an attempted mass lynching, but like one held in the middle of a three-ring circus. Yaki played an important leadership role in which he led activists to adopt innovative tactics and strategies. Sometimes people hearing about this assume that the stereotypical capitalistic concepts of what that might mean. Of someone like Yaki sitting in his cell, sending off little kites, do this and do that, to followers like a Godfather scenario, far from the reality. First off, since the state was putting on trial key members from all the black youth gangs inside Pontiac, there was no lack of decision makers and leaders, good or bad. The dominant gang in Pontiac were the gangsters' disciples, whose brilliant leader, Larry Hoover, was a major target of the prosecutions and among the first group of defendants up for trial. You should know that Hoover was to the development of U.S. youth gangs as Thomas Edison was to electricity, and every question involving this trial and his gang's future was being seriously thought out by them. Then you had an aggressive crowd of many attorneys, especially the radical lawyers from the People's Law Office, who had successfully represented Fred Hampton's family and other Panthers in long, bitter legal battles against the U.S. government and the Chicago police. And Chokwe Lubumba of the PGRNA, for that matter, other veteran new African activists became seriously involved too, like Don T. of the Pontiac Prison Collective. Lawyers visited potential witnesses and remaining defendants in prison there would often call Don T. and other revolutionaries out to the visiting room so that they could talk to the young prisoners about the political nature of this fight. So there was not only leadership, but so much of it that at times there was almost a canopy of many strong voices. A cacophony. I gotta look up this word, everybody. I don't think I said it right. Cacophony. I gotta look up this word, everybody. I don't think I said it right. Cacophony. I gotta look up this word, everybody. I don't think I said it right. It's cacophony. And cacophony means cacophony is a noun referring to a harsh, discordant mixture of sounds or an incongruous, chaotic blend of elements. I think I said that right. All right. Okay. So many strong voices. Nevertheless, Yaki's leadership was planned to insiders by the battle's end. What he had done was to shape a radical overall strategy in ways both large and small. Yaki set the political line and identifying the battle as a continuation of white Americans' war on new African community as a whole. Okay, it was about G-side. It wasn't really about the deaths of those guards as individuals. It wasn't about gangs, and it certainly wasn't about crime. These gang members were being set. Sorry, I'm changing the page. Let me put this up here. Were being set up for death row, in the same way that many black men had been arrested and convicted almost at random whenever a white settler had been touched and the ruling class wanted to strike terror into the colonized minds. Meanwhile, the white public at large knew nothing about this, aided by the instant white out of television news and a daily newspaper. The prosecutors and the politicians pounded home their white lies that the defendants had no chance of escaping conviction. Really, the biggest lie was that the police and the prosecutors had any real idea of who had done it. They literally didn't have a clue. The prison wasn't even searched for weapons or other evidence until October 2nd. Over 2 months later, it was less like CSI and more like Three Stooges. Since the government's plan was the tired and true all-American strategy of just whipping up more and more racism as their lethal weapon, the defendants were pictured in a state's propaganda as not only black criminals, but black gang criminals. And even worse, black gang criminals who were conspiring together against white people. The lowest of the low, the worst of the worst. The government led the docile white public into the assumption that any black young gang member had to be guilty of anything and everything, so long as it was evil. So the public got a big shock in 1981 when the jury came back in the first of the mass murder trials and found the defendants innocent of all charges. All the murder prosecutions had to be dropped. Politicians and police and media were stunned and outraged. All along, many prisoners had talked about how a tiny, not too bright crew had tried to vault over all the established gangs by pulling a stunningly unintelligent attack, which immediately got way out of hand. But why listen to new African men who were officially, quote, the scum of the earth? In Yaki's strategy, educating and organizing against G-side in the community was the main thrust. Support from white liberals was good, but wouldn't be priority. Almost immediately outside New African Prisoner Organization, the NAPO, members and supporters began a coalition of concerned organization. A very vocal demonstration of several hundred protesters drove down from Chicago and chanted loudly outside the Pontiac gates. Although far from the big city in media attention, NAPO understood that the major media would be whiting out their grassroots struggles away. But the Pontiac prisoners would be encouraged by the show of support. The word would spread through them and their families into the large communities. In an innovative move, Yaki scrapped the usual way that defense committees were set up. Instead of a single committee or coalition, which usually ends up being dominated by white left groups with their own agenda and feuds, NAPO pushed to have some separate committees, coordinating but different. A new African committee built around the mothers and families and friends of the defendants did low-key but important work, educating people around them at the grassroots level. Church presentations and meetings in the House projects pressured low-level black politicians to take stands, even passing around literature on the special buses, which take women down to the prison for visits, while the white support committees built around a few full-time organizers who had themselves been organized and politicized by Yaki himself, concentrated on both coalition activity with other progressive causes and working closely as the intelligence system for the legal defense. With their initial disadvantage of having no legal case, seldom just by itself a barrier to shipping new Africans to death row. The prosecution was further shot down in jury selection, unable to bar all new African jury candidates as they wanted. The prosecutors never noticed that one woman juror lived right around the corner from where the Black Panther Free Health Clinic had been, while another had gone to school in the town of Maywood with Fred Hampton's family. Just like the guerrilla warfare, we know the terrain, but the enemy does not. While white potential jurors who would automatically vote for convicting, new Africans were identified so that they could be eliminated as jurors, of course, by NAPO supporters working as investigators in their neighborhoods. It was a full court press. The separation was the controversial move, as it tossed aside the usual show of interracial unity for the substance of specific functions and grassroots politic works. The NAPO worked with the most political of the attorneys to push the courtroom focus into government misconduct and G-side. Putting the state on trial, not the defendants. The resulting victory, especially after some pivotal new African jurors joined the celebrating families of the defendants on the court, was happy proof of the effective campaign. One of the largest mass lynching attempts in many years had been smashed down, and smashed down hard. The score in this battle, the new African 17, Pig 0, Yaki, had proven that his radical guerrilla approach was perfectly practical for the oppressed. By the late 1990s, though, the situation had changed substantially for Yaki, for the camps everywhere in the U.S. were shifting more filled with macho drug selling and auto homicide way of life. Young men who had been increasingly drug-washed and brainwashed by neocolonialism obediently taught that their goal should be killing off themselves and people just like them as quickly as possible. Also, the Black Revolution that had lifted and carried him along from the 1960s on had finally turned and was ebbing rapidly at generational change time. Many of his closest prison movements, rads, had gotten out and scattered or had died. Go on to the next page, everybody. Still on the introduction. It's a long introduction, everybody. Even his ability to do his political teachings by pen was effective. When Yaki started out in prison, he had amassed a real library of political and history books, together with magazines and files of documents and correspondence. And he spent hours and hours studying and writing. Thank you for the birthday wishes. I appreciate that. This gradually became more and more choked off by prison authorities, as he put it. Quote, inside it only grows worse, not better, because they keep changing wardens, and every warden has to prove that they've made some change or new shit they can point out, which is only more restrictions. By the start of the 20th century, he was limited to one thin cardboard case, only a few inches high, which had to hold any books, magazines, newspapers, notebooks, files, letters, blank paper, pencils, and pens he had in his cell. And he had to work mandatory 8-hour shifts every day at the usual make-work prison jobs, such as counting out and counting in the checker pieces in the day room, which cut down on his intellectual hours. All this led him to decide to center himself on one major project, which only required 2 books: the reprisal and explanation of Frantz Fanon, great revolutionary writings, Wretched of the Earth. Winning his release in 2004 after 33 years was an incredible thing for Yaki and his comrades. Any time afterwards that he was complaining about a bad day, he'd often be quick to add, but it's a lot better than being in Dixon. And he was adjusting to a world that had changed so much since he had gone inside. After walking through a Target one afternoon, he said, quote, "It was disorienting to me. I've never been in a store this large. In his generations and place, it was a commonplace for youth to have no experience with American things like department stores or sitting down restaurants other than fast food. Then, in the late fall of 2007, he became ill, coughing a lot. Soon, it was discovered that Yaki had terminal lung cancer. He passed across the river, a life and death on March 28th, 2008. Still young at almost 60, it was a blow from an unexpected direction, a loss that is too much to measure right now. At his memorial, rads, I think they're comrades, came from all over the country to show their respect and talk about how much he had done for all of us. This came as politically, Yaki was quietly trying to start things all over again. He had played an active role in the Free Zulu campaign committee to get the, I think this is from India, maybe not Indiana nationalist prisoners, I think, okay, and an artist, Zulu Azarina, off death row with a fierce legal defense. Zolo did indeed get his death penalty turned over and won a real release date as well. Together with outside rads and supporters, Yaki had already found the committee to free C number prisoners, which has grown into a regular active presence in Chicago's new African community. Once on Southside, Yaki became the group's coordinator. C-number prisoners in Illinois were sentences for major crimes during a strange interim stage in the earlier 1970s before the full transition to new sentencing laws were made. Yaki was a C-number prisoner himself. The major characteristic is that they did not earn, quote, good time or day for a day to reduce their sentences. Instead, C-number prisoners must serve their full sentences unless they are granted release by the parole board. It was becoming something of a settler political patronage scheme. Former police and law enforcement officials and ex-prosecutors who are politically connected get paid for being on the board. Coming to occasional meetings in which they grudgingly released a few prisoners every year just to keep their racket going. Yaki strongly believed in keeping the heat turned up under them, as he was insisting with a characteristic bluntness. Right now, there is no revolutionary movement at all, quote unquote. He was frustrated and more than ready to build all over again, while, as he confessed, still learned this new world of the 20th century. Yaki was preparing to move to a new stage to focus revolutionary thought on the more subtle but even more violent new type of neocolonialism that had changed the rules of the game. That's why he thought it was so important to do a retake of Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, which had first started to deal with this neocolonialism much more clearly. Yaki was still dead set on anti-capitalism, still a socialist, and still a warrior of the nation, for the nation. The main writing of this book, in his meditations of Frantz Fanon's book, Wretched of the Earth, some comrades reading this early draft of this were upset. They thought that Yaki would give them some easier reading than Wretched itself, and simplified version, maybe some summaries or some condensed versions of the high points. Yaki could have done that. He didn't want to. Teaching himself wasn't easy. He worked hard for what he knew and respected the understanding of that work as much as the goal itself. So what Yaki wrote was a guide to help us more seriously study Fanon, put more effort into it, dig even deeper into what Fanon was really saying, which is the opposite of trying to breeze through it, hopefully hitting the exciting points, which is all too often our normal approach to study. So Yaki was telling us to become more serious people, to change ourselves so that we could change the world around us. That is the start of what he felt he left us. But first, we begin with the section of some of Yaki's most important earlier writings. This is only a small sample, since his work in different publications probably totals many hundred of pages. The first of these is an article, War of the Cities, sterilized in the 3 issues in the memographed prison magazine, Diffuse, between January and April 1978. This magazine grew out of the newsletter Stateville Raps and was published by the New African Prisoner Organization in Chicago. The War for the Cities was significant because it put on the table in plain language the U.S. Empire's sweeping plans to empty out the great black inner city communities, to end the threat of black revolution by breaking up, marginalizing, and imprisoning our population. What Yaki urged everyone to mobilize against when it was still early enough to block. The article was he urged everyone to mobilize against when it was still early enough to block. The article was also important because it was where Yaki started to, quote, make it plain. About the hidden reality, also important because it was where Yaki started to, quote, make it plain. About the hidden reality of Black G-side, a subject that he would never let go of as long as he had breath to speak. Then there was a short but important article, Free the RNA 11, Prisoners of War, which first appeared on January through February 1978 issue of The Fuse. It reports on a now little known struggle in the Deep South, which turned critical in 1970 to 1971, when a campaign of violent police repression began in Jackson, Mississippi and Louisiana against the pioneering attempts of Black nationalists, provisional government of the Republic of New Africa, PGRNA, to organize a mass vote among Black citizens on democratically setting up a country of their own. Local and federal white officials made no secret of the fact that the main crime was holding Black liberation views, and that they were determined to remove every Black person there with such views by peaceful or violent means. Ironically, a generation later, in Jackson, Mississippi, Chakwe Lumumba, a leader of the PGRNA, has been elected to the city council. Transforming the colonial and criminal mentality is one of the most deeply probed works of theory/practice of the 60s, Black Revolution. Exploring the nature of our widespread youth rebellion through crime, Yaki uses several scenes from the famous film Battle of Algiers to show the relationship between young criminal rebellion and the deeper change of liberation. First writers. We're almost done with this part. First written in 1977, published by the Stateville Prison Organization, the notes from the New African POW Journal Book 1. It was revised and added to the 1981, and it is Yaki's later version that is printed here. This is followed by both scenes from the Battle of Algiers, which pins the lessons of colonial and criminal mentality down to revisiting parts of the film script and raids on Chicago's public housing. This is a leaflet that had been distributed in the Chicago projects together with Yaki's added commentary about the campaign of police raids and prisons-like restrictions of Black residents. All these writings were reprinted in Crossroads newsletter, published by Spears and Shields publication in April 1989. 3 articles close this first section of the book, from one generation to the next, about the rich continuity of the new African culture of communality and struggle. Published in 1980, Malcolm X, Model of Personal Transformation, about prisoners using Malcolm's lessons to change their own lives. Published in Crossroads, spring 2001, and Reflection of Victory Surges, What Everyone Should Know About State Repression, a guide on thinking about security against police surveillance. This last article was published as part of Spears and Shields pamphlet, so that we don't fool ourselves again. Few had the opportunity to work with Yaki, but in these writings, his revolutionary politics still burn and help light the difficult path ahead for all of us. The editor. Salam. All right.
So we're done with the introduction.
Introduction's done. Let me look ahead real quick. Okay, we do have some stopping points. Yeah, okay, cool. We do have some stopping points. Okay. So, we're going to go ahead and read War of the City, Part 1. And let's see if we can get to Part 2. Here we go. Chicago African, Black, Puerto Rican, and poor white communities are showing much concern over the plans now in progress to remove them from the inner city into outlying areas. Throughout the America, they use the KKK one, the triple K one. The population of major cities are increasingly poor, and the majority of the poor are Africans. These growing populations have the potential to acquire and use great power. Those who rule America know instinctively that the cities are politically, economically, militarily too valuable to them to be allowed to fall under the control of the African and other oppressed nations. We intend to devote more space to future issues of the fuse, to this and other essential areas of struggle taking place outside the walls. What we would like to do here is make several points about African inner city removal. We think these points have clear connections to the reasons for there being such large numbers of young African men and women in Illinois and other U.S. prisons. We also think that a better understanding of these and other points will help bring the struggles outside closer to the struggle inside. We'll start with what should some of the most evident, easily understood and accepted points. The first of these is that African inner city removal is a nationwide strategic objective of those who, of those who rule America. This objective, remember, every time he says America, add the 3 Ks. Amerikka. This objective is made necessary in large part by the deepening economic crisis and the threat of political social revolution. The wealth and high standards of living the U.S. prides itself on is based on its history and trickery and robbery. The U.S. is wealthy because it takes the wealth of others, deprives most of the world from using their resources from their own development. When the people of Africa, Asia, and South America begin to change this state of things, it is reflected in the U.S. by an energy crisis and in many other forms. Also, when America has less to steal from other countries, it has less booty to distribute inside its own borders. Jobs grow scarce. So-called affirmative action is in employment, and school administration is challenged. School lunch and daycare programs are cut back or halted. Poor women are denied federal funds for abortions, and large numbers of Africans and other oppressed nation women are, quote, intensively encouraged to adopt birth control and become sterilized. Prison population increases, and increasing attention is focused on the cities in ways too numerous to list and analyze here. The next point is that the plans now being carried out to achieve African inner city removal are now, quote, new, and certainly not in Chicago. Neither are such plans the only ones being carried out or experimented with to contain and or manipulate U.S. developing world oppressed nation population. The plans being affected now were first formulated 10 to 20 years ago. People are able to make long-range strategic plans when they have, or at least understand, power. Power is not acquired or maintained by being, quote, issued oriented, unclear on who and where you are, or by mistaking enemies for friends. The need to not make mistake enemies for friends is especially great for us. Part of the reason for our being, quote, issued oriented is that we don't yet see the need to assume responsibility in the development of the strategies affecting our lives. Those who rule develop strategies. Those who are misgoverned and oppressed merely respond to oppressive issues and conditions as they arise and as the suffering triggers our awareness. Hello, Mr. Carrot. We leave the strategy to others because we do not yet think of ourselves as able and worthy of self-government. We still think of oppressors as the authority under which our lives can continue. Until we begin to see those who rule America as adversaries, we will always be the object of inner city removal, which is simply one of the forms of America's unique brand of fascist administration and genocide. Point three is that the oppressed are not simply being pushed from the inner city to roam and settle wherever they may please, just as it's being decided where we will move from. It's also being decided where we'll be allowed to relocate. In raising this point, many things come to mind. The most immediate is simply the fact that there is no, quote, free choice, no equal opportunity for the oppressed in America to participate in the democratic process of city planning. What also comes to mind are visions of South African type, Bantunism, Bantustans. It's Bantustans. I can't say it. Of a Soweto type, Soweto, suburbs which surround the white cities, like Africans are allowed to enter only to work and only if they have their passbook. Point 4 is that all of the above helps us to see more clearly exactly why our communities have been allowed to deteriorate, why there are increasing cases of arsons, why the schools our children attend don't offer them the quality education which would allow them to acquire the skills and confidence acquired of peoples who have the need and desire to govern themselves. Our communities are filled with abandoned buildings because it's part of the plan to remove the African and other oppressed peoples from the inner city. Our schools lack qualified teachers, and sufficient numbers are in poor physical conditions. The lack books and other essential equipment because it's part of the plan to relocate us and to keep us ignorant and unskilled and dependent upon those who rule America. Point 5 is that we are likely to see more, quote, low-income housing going up in suburbs like Arlington Heights, truly designed with the oppressed in mind. This low-income housing will likely include innovations which are now being tested in U.S. prisons and in areas such as Calabrin Green city states, and federal money has been spent liberally over the past several years on pilot projects such as that now operating in Cabrini Green housing projects. I think it's Cabrini. I can't say it. The streets and buildings surrounding the housing area have been altered to fit police and military emergency needs. The design of the buildings are altered to give only one way of exit and entrance. So-called convenience shops, or for laundry, dry cleaning, food shopping, and other essential services have been placed in the building so that movement outside of them is reduced. Offices are installed for the welfare agent and the security officers. All occupants are issued identity cards to be shown upon entering or leaving the building. The occupants of each apartment are listed in a central register. Electric cameras and other surveillance equipment is installed allegedly to, quote, provide resident security against crime and criminals. But the cameras operate 24 hours a day. They don't turn themselves on automatically by the scent or sound of a criminal. The cameras watch everybody all the time, just like they do here in Statevilles and other prisons in America. Everything described above as part of the pilot projects being carried out in Africa and other oppressed communities in the U.S. were first pilot projects in the prisons, usually those with the largest number of Africans and other oppressed nations prisoners. The sixth and last point deserves more space than we're able to give it. That clear and important connections can be drawn between the plan to remove the oppressed from the inner city and the presence of such a large number of non-white in Illinois, and other American prisons. In essence, the prisons are filled with African youth because of the danger they did and do present to the rulers of the U.S. In the 60s and early 70s, African people's fight for self-determination was at a high point, and African youth were playing important roles in many areas of struggle. In the schools, at the job sites, on picket lines, and demonstrations, and on the streets. African youth were daily becoming a greater threat to the oppressive power. One area where this threat was most clear was among African youth organizations, where their revolutionary and nationalist potentials was evident through their actions in the community. African youth were united, disciplined, concerned about African people, and committed to changing our conditions. They provided leadership and had the respect and love of the people. They were in many cases providing some of the best examples and love of the people. They were in many cases providing some of the best examples of community self-government. During this period, it was expedient that Jesse Jackson to have his picture taken sitting at the feet of Jeff Fort, and for other African youth leaders to be invited to the White House. Once the revolutionary and nationalist potential was clearly recognized by the enemy, drugs poured into the community. African youth organizations became the target of the FBI's COINTELPRO programs, a program designed to prevent African unity, to stifle revolutionary nationalist development, to crush the movement for self-determination among African people. The enemy media began to create a climate of fear in the African communities by distorting crime, figures, and occurrences. They made all African youth, especially African youth organizations, appear as criminals and enemies of African people and our progress. And because the enemy had African youth appear as the enemies of Africa, of African advancement along the road of self-determination, African people felt relieved rather than alarmed when brothers were given long sentences and placed in prisons. African people felt relieved rather than alarmed when brothers were given long sentences and placed in prisons. Those who rule Chicago and the rest of America were truly relieved after they separated African people. Those who rule Chicago and the rest of America were truly relieved after they separated African people in this way. They considered the imprisonment of African youth a sufficient means of bringing to the ebb the rising tide of African resistance, time enough at least for them to regroup, rethink, devise, and employ other tactics and strategies, and to strengthen their flanks. But as African youth entered American prisons in large numbers, the prisons became the front of battle. The development of awareness and commitment and the formulation of revolutionary and nationalist consciousness and the fight for African self-determination did not end when the prison gates closed. African men and women in prisons now know why we are here and what we must do. We know that our ties to our people are unbreakable, and our determination cannot be shaken. The prisons are incubators. We study and struggle daily, and grow strong from the repression, concrete and steel. The walls cannot contain our minds nor our bodies. We're bringing the prison and the community closer together. Those who rule must tremble at the thought of the purpose of our imprisonment being nullified. Okay, hold on a second. I can't read this one, but it has George Jackson's. I can't read it because it's all in cursive, so I'll keep going. How are we doing on time? I think we'll stop at part 2. Yeah, we'll stop at part 2, page 50 for me. Thank you for the happy birthday. Appreciate that. All right. Is there anything you'd like to say, Doodley?
I would say that this brings up a quote in my mind, like with the most recent thing that was brought up. It was made by Malcolm X. If you aren't careful, the newspapers will have you hating the oppressed. And I feel like that quote goes for more than just newspapers. It goes for all of media.
It's kind of wild that like one of the biggest reasons why they're overly incarcerating black people is because of the revolutionary potential and challenging the state and removing the state and destroying it. And then like you said, they utilize that towards the other black community to say these people are violent. So like, yeah, they turned against each other. That's the colonial standards, to turn each other inwards and fight amongst each other. It's just turning out towards the state and fighting the state. It does that. It does that all the time.
It's a cultural form of divide and conquer.
Exactly that. You know, and as white people, like, we do have a task amongst us. We have a task of destroying and dismantling the white supremacist structures that we allow to exist, because we have to do somewhat of a suicide, right? A racial suicide. So like, no longer want the systems of oppressions to suicide, right? A racial suicide. So like, no longer want the systems of oppressions to oppress. And we are in the privileged position to tear down these oppressive systems and allow, you know what I mean? As white people to, and we are in the privileged position to tear down these oppressive systems and allow, you know what I mean? As white people, to take down the white aristocracy that buffers between, you know, the state and stuff like that, to keep it in existence. Yeah. Yeah, you were gonna say something else?
Only just to continue to agree.
Yeah, you were gonna say something else?
Only just to continue to agree with what you were saying. And then I realized that was enough.
Yeah. So, you know, this is going to be a good book. I'm going to keep Wretched of the Earth next to me, because I know when I last read this, it talked about, like, it had like keys at like paragraph 1, section 3, you know what I mean? And he did something. So I might keep the Wretched of the Earth next to me to see if that might help us too. I don't know how this is going to look, you know? But hopefully we keep learning and we keep... Is this your second time going through this book, or your first?
Second time, but I don't remember anything from the first read.
Yeah. I bet as we read, things will come up for sure. And it's you know what? After reading Tip of the Spear and then this book talking about the new front can be the prison system, because most of the revolutionaries and the political prisoners are there. So that is a link in the chain of the frontal assault, in a sense, you know, for the revolution. That's why we need to put in connection. That's why they talk about, we need to put the connections, people outside the wall connected with the peoples inside the wall. So that way we can have two different fronts that engage with the enemy. You know what I mean?
Yeah, parallel movement. And parallel movement is very important because when you cut them off from all sides is when they're easiest to take down.
Yep. Yeah. Isolation. We got to isolate. And I hope like, and yeah, we got to isolate. Once they're isolated, they're easier to take out and isolated. So that, yeah, that's awesome. All right. Is there anything else that you'd like to say before we close it out? Anybody have any questions? Anything to add?
I guess I do want to add on that I do like how it mentioned that revolution comes from a place of love. And yeah, I agree with that.
Yep.
So much love and take care.
Yep. Also, Mr. Carrot, you're correct. So they can control the people. Exactly. All right, everybody. Take care of yourself. Drink water. Eat food. Know that you exist, and that when we collectivize with one another, we are stronger than the state. The state is scared of us collectivizing and actually forming groups and becoming together. The state is scared of it. That's why they lash out the way they do with like things like ICE, because they want us to stay controlled. So, everybody,